So reading from Judges 6, verses 11 to 16. The angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah that belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. When the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." "But sir," Gideon replied, "if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our fathers told us about when they said, 'Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt?' But now the Lord has abandoned us and put us into the hand of Midian." The Lord turned to him and said, "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" "But Lord," Gideon asked, "how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." The Lord answered, "I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites together."
Thanks, Roger. So I'm going to hand over to Rob.
Okay. Is everybody all ready? We've been looking at that at this series of the judges in Israel, the unlikely people in Israel's history who ended up in Hebrews 11 being called heroes, whereas most people wouldn't have thought of calling them that, even after they'd done what they'd done. The timing of this is after Joshua has brought the nation into the land of Israel, the promised land, and before the time of the kings. And I want to focus on the call of Gideon, which is why I asked for that passage to be read. Because the important thing we need to understand is that God's call comes to people that most people wouldn't look twice at. I mean, King David was so disregarded by his own family, he wasn't even invited to the party. And he had to be sent for because he was still looking after the sheep. And there are many other examples in the scriptures of people who are disregarded by the world, by their own family, by whatever, for whatever reasons, who are not perfect and who are nevertheless called by God for some particular purpose or some more general purpose with a particular flavor to it. And I want us to focus today. It's good to listen to the story. We probably know it quite well already, but it's good to hear it again. But the important thing is, what is God trying to say to us? Because we too, if we're Christians, are people under a general call. You can read it in Matthew 28, where he says we're to go out and be witnesses and he will be with us to the end of the age. Now, that's general. All Christians are called for that. So what has God been saying to me, to you, about what your call is and how to respond to it? And that's what I hope we're going to learn from this story today. Because God develops our call. He polishes it up, if you like. He shows us, first of all, what our general responsibility is within the Christian community. And he places us in positions where, despite all our background and problems and experiences which haven't been very helpful and so on, and even despite the experiences that have been helpful, where he builds into us a specific call and says, this is what I want you to do in the situation in which you have been placed. And the important thing that we need to remember, which I shall repeat later on, is this. We don't have to think who we are. We have to remember who he is. That's the key to this. I am who God says I am. So, I think this is the last passage in the series, the call of Gideon. I just want to go through that little story again that you've just heard read from the scriptures. The Midianites were, you remember that the people of Israel had moved into their promised land, but they hadn't really conquered it properly. They hadn't been following the Lord's instructions, and so there was a whole lot of resistance still around them. And mainly at this stage in their lives, they were living in little communities which were basically surrounded by enemies. And in this case, they were being surrounded by the Midianites. And the Midianites were trying to deal with the Israelite invaders, as they saw them, by raiding the land, stealing all the crops every time there was a harvest, taking away the livestock, and basically making their lives a complete misery in the hope that they would go away. And if anybody came to attack them, they would destroy the people as well. But fundamentally, they were simply clearing the land so that the people couldn't live there. And the Bible describes them as like locusts. That's exactly what locusts do, isn't it? They clear the land and everybody starves. And that's why Gideon was hiding in the winepress. Now, threshing is something you do in the open air. There are threshing floors that exist still around in the country here. There's one over on the main road between here and Tewkesbury. It used to be a threshing floor, at least I presume by the name of it, it did. So what you did, you went on a big, flat, hard surface and you bashed your corn, and you got the wind blew all the chaff away, and you ended up with the grain. Gideon was doing that in a wine press, indoors. Imagine what an enormous mess he was making. All of that would have to be cleared up, otherwise he couldn't even make the wine later. He was hiding. He was scared. He was totally unqualified, in his opinion, to be anything but he didn't want anything to do with the Midianites. They were in charge as far as he was concerned. And so when the angel came and said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior," I know what I would have said. I would have said, "I'm sorry, you've just got the wrong address. This is not the right place. You've come to the wrong shop." But the angel didn't stop there. He went on, and the Lord said, "Go in the strength you have and save Israel." And Gideon thought, that you've got the wrong place. But even if you haven't got the wrong place, you've got the wrong man. My clan is one of the weakest. It was part of a somewhat disregarded tribe. It's famous in the Old Testament for being called the half tribe of Manasseh. And I think people use that in a derogatory sense. I know they had their own area to live, and they were regarded in the allocation of space as a tribe, but they were still called the half tribe of Manasseh. They weren't highly regarded. They weren't like Judah with great fame, even in those days. So he's in the weakest clan, in one of the weaker tribes. And then he says, and on top of that, I'm right at the bottom of the family heap even. He said, even the family think I'm nothing. And so what does the Lord say to him? "I will be with you. You will strike down the enemy hordes." That's what God said. And Gideon is left wondering what on earth this is going to mean and how he's going to do anything about it. Where do I go from here? God says that, but here am I hiding in this place, scared of the Midianites, biting my fingernails and wondering what to do. I want to say 3 points about the call before we move on to the rest of the story. First of all, it was unexpected. God doesn't always come when you're sitting there saying, "Lord, I think I need a call today." He doesn't. My own experience is that he very rarely comes when you say that. He will hear it, but he waits until he's ready to give you the call. And when it comes, it can very often come at a very unexpected time. I'm going to tell you later various stories about our experiences, and particularly in relation to our adventure with God, which was without any doubt at all the teaching centre on the Isle of Wight. And it starts here. Our call came at an extremely unexpected time. We weren't ready for it at all. And I had no idea that I was even going to be called. I was sitting in the front garden recovering from chemotherapy. Now, that is not a time when you're thinking, "God, what am I going to do tomorrow?" It's the time when you're thinking, how am I going to be still okay to do anything tomorrow? And yet God came to me with an absolutely clarion call, which made it very clear what he wanted me to do, or us to do, because it involved both of us. I just want to say that calls come unexpectedly. And the second thing that we learn from this is that they are uncompromising. God doesn't say, oh, well, perhaps you'll do half the job. No, he never said that to Gideon. He said, you're a mighty warrior. And when Gideon said, no, I'm not, he said, yes, you are, because I'm going to be with you. That's the key. That's the key. Do we believe God? And he said, when he says he'll be with us, when he calls, will he not promise to be with us as well? He doesn't expect us to do it on our own 2 feet. So it's unexpected, it's uncompromising, and it's challenging. Now, if your call is a real one, it will be all of those things in some degree or another. I'm absolutely sure of that, because God calls us out of our comfort zones. If we are wanting to sit still and twiddle our thumbs, God's call will challenge us. We are going to need, when whatever God calls us to, even if it's something fairly small and insignificant, like, for example, once in my teenage years, I was called to ring somebody up. The trouble was, I only knew this person vaguely, and I did know that his father was a high court judge. Not the sort of person you want to ring up out of the blue and say, would you like to come and hear Billy Graham speak? However, I did, and he did, and that's Graham Dow, and he became a bishop. So God knew what he was doing. All I'm saying is this, that when God calls, we're going to need an element of bravery to do what he says. That's the first thing. We're going to have to be prepared to take a little risk or two, or maybe a big risk, but a risk. We're going to have to be expecting to move out of our comfort zones. And Gideon had to face all of that. He will have had consciously and deliberately to cancel his doubts with God's help, to forget all his insecurities that he had mentioned with God's help, and to learn faith in God. And so do we. At whatever level, however big or small the call, it will have those factors in it. When I was at the Bible class that I was brought up in, when I started there at about age 9, I was put into that. We were in 2 groups within the Bible class, named after Livingstone and Carey. I was in Carey. You've all heard of Livingstone. You may not have heard of Carey, but he's just as good a missionary. He went to India. And one of the famous things that he said was, in fact, probably the most quoted thing that he said was this: expect great things from God, attempt great things for God. God does not call us when we think we're qualified. He qualifies us when we don't think that we're ready, and when he calls us. So to put that more pithily, he doesn't call you when you're qualified. He doesn't call you when you're qualified. He qualifies you when you're called. And if we insulate ourselves from inconvenience and risk, we will be cutting ourselves off, not just from fulfilling the purpose God has for us at that moment, but also from great adventures with God. We need to see our circumstances in the light of God's promises to us. He said, you will defeat. He didn't say, perhaps you'll do a good job. He said, you will defeat. And if we trust him, then we will. We do have to learn that whatever we're doing, we are not under the circumstances. And here's where I want to just use my personal experience to illustrate that. I've already talked about the call that we had to set up the centre. But the thing about the call was, one of the things about the call was that it was absolutely detailed. I've mentioned before, I ended up writing down about half a page of A4 of notes on what God said. Now, I have to say that is, in my experience and in the experience of others I've spoken with, an unusual thing. He will call you generally, and the detail will follow as he polishes the vision up step by step. But on this occasion, the first step was to give me a whole page, half a page of notes on what he wanted me to do. So, and I want to say something about this, because the normal process is that you will get the details, but one at a time. We had a girl in our Bible study group when we were first on the Isle of Wight, and she came along one evening and she said, God spoke to me at work. And I said, oh, good. I said, what was it all about? And she said, he told me to go and get my Bible because there was something he wanted to show me. And I said, well, what did he show you? And she said, oh, well, I was busy getting some towels, so I never got it. And so God said, well, you're not ready then. What an adventure she missed. I don't know what God was going to tell her to do, but it was a great sadness in my heart that she hadn't heard it, because she didn't do what he said. We are always in that position with God. If we don't do it, it's because we're not ready. But God says we are ready when he calls us. And it's we who make ourselves not ready by being disobedient. That is so key to getting on with God's adventures. It really is, every step of the way. Anyway, to come back to the building up of the centre. The second problem was that the circumstances we were in were extremely unconducive to setting up anything. First of all, I was not working because I was ill. And when I got better, the governors would have expected me to go back and be a head teacher again. And indeed, when they appointed me, they virtually said, well, of course, you'll be here until the end of your career, won't you? And because at that time I thought I would, I said, well, probably I will. And I thought I would, but God had other views. But the point was, if I were to retire from there, it would let them down. And so I had to concern myself about that, because it wasn't right that in God's name I should let people down. So God had to sort that one out, which he did. Because what happened was, County Hall rang me up and said, we want to give you a fixed term contract. Will you please let the governors know that we're pinching you from their school? So it was County Hall that got the blame, not me. And they were quite pleased, because if I was worthy of being hauled into the County Hall, I must have been the right choice in the first place. So everybody was happy. And Sylvia, she was working too in another school. And so we had to pray about how Sylvia could be released from her role. What happened? She was made redundant. Now, you might not think we could rejoice about that, but we did, because God answered our prayer. He got both of us out of the jobs we were doing with honor, and both of us were released from the work. So that's the circumstances being dealt with. God deals with our circumstances. If he calls us, he moves us from where we are to a place where he needs us to be by his means. And I think it's very important that. So the second thing was that we had to make changes to the house. And although I'm not going to go into the detail about that, that was quite a serious problem, because there were a lot of things that we needed to do. And the first thing he put on my list was, you need to take out the old staircase and put in one with a 90-degree bend in it, which was perfectly true. That's what we did need to do in order to amalgamate the house into a more useful centre, because otherwise it would have remained two separate bits. And so I thought, well, okay, Lord, that's what we need. I agreed that's what we need. What are we going to do about it? The very next day, I went to visit a Christian friend, and he had exactly the staircase we needed for sale. You cannot believe it, can you? But it's true. That really is the truth. God changes circumstances to bring about the purposes he has. And he changed Gideon's circumstances, and he will change your circumstances. Whatever he calls you to do, he will provide the steps, step by step, to bring you to the point where you can do it. And then thirdly, there was the one with the test. That will happen too. You will find there is a test. And this one was that we were going to end up with no money, no income anyway. So all I want to say in response to that is that God did provide it. I don't want to explain why and how, because that's not the point. The point of the story is this. We realized we were not going to be very well off. And so when County Hall sent, after I'd retired to start the centre off, sent their man round, the head of the personnel department, as it used to be called in those days before they invented better names for it. He came round with a job description for the job that I was invited to apply for, which would have meant a 10,000 a year raise from what I'd been paid before. And it took Sylvia and me 20 minutes to say no, because we knew that God had called us. And so we let that go. We did think for 5 minutes out of those 20 what we could do with an extra 10,000 a year and how much we could contribute to the church and etc. But God was never saying yes to it, and we just let go of it. What I want to say is that God was faithful to his promise. We were never short. Whenever we needed anything, we got it. And very often we got it before we knew we needed it. It was amazing. So what I want to say is this. If God calls you, there are stages you will go through, somewhat like the ones that Gideon and we went through, but each step of the way, he will be with you because he says he will. If he's called you, he's going to be with you. And if he doesn't say it, that is a surprise. He will say it. Unless, of course, you're so sure he will that he doesn't need to say it. And then maybe he'll just give you little steps of encouragement along the way. But he will do that as well. And then the second phase of the story is the battle. Right, Gideon is now moving on to doing something about God's call. And so God gives him the battle strategy. If you want to read what that was, you can read it. The important thing about battle strategy is this. God will show you his battle strategy, and there is a serious danger of thinking that it'd be much better if you help God along. It's not the way to go. It's dangerous if we start trying to help God in that way. God does not need helping out. Jesus faced that temptation himself. He was told he could jump off the temple and his objectives would be achieved. But he said, no, they won't, because that's not God's way of doing it. And we all will face that test if we're going to do something for God. We will. So don't think you're going to avoid it. You will be tested about whether you're prepared to let God do it his way. So the consequence of knowing that you need to let God do it his way is that you need to pray. I haven't said that so far, but that's the obvious thing. You need to do a lot of praying. Each thing you need to pray about. And you need, now, when you're praying about something, you should be consciously listening out for God to tell you what he wants to say about this thing you're praying about. A prayer which says, please God, do this, and then you don't even bother to concern yourself about what he says for the answer, isn't really a prayer at all. It's got to be a genuine prayer. It's got to be what I call a type A prayer. A prayer that says, Lord, we need to go the way you want. We need to know how to do it, and we're listening. And when you are, these are the things you need to listen out for. He may speak to you through any of these ways or all of them. First of all, your regular Bible reading is a key place to start. Pray each day, Lord, is there anything you want to say to me out of today's Bible reading? He may even talk to you, if you have them, through the Bible reading notes, because note writers are Christians and they will make comments on the passage which may prompt you to think again about something that you read in the passage that is relevant to the prayer you've been asking. The next thing is church. Believe it or not, Meeting in church, I know I said something different the other day at a meeting, but believe it or not, meeting in church is absolutely essential, or at least with the church. Doesn't have to be on a Sunday necessarily. Your midweek meeting, your prayer meeting, anytime you're meeting with the Christians is a place when you can expect to hear from God. People may speak out a word of prophecy, which may be for you directly and you recognize it, or they may just be sharing something which they have no idea is prophetic until God says, that's for you. I can remember a specific occasion when that happened to me, but that's not the point. God bashed me on the shoulder is the best way I can describe it, and said, this next bit's for you. Now, that doesn't happen very often. It's very helpful when it does, but don't expect that. Just be listening. Don't wait for God to tell you he's going to tell you. Wait for him to tell you and hear it the first time. That's the best way. Anyway, the point is this, that church fellowship times are important ways of hearing what God has to say. Secondly, other people who maybe not even Christians, conversations in the street. There may be just a Christian conversation in the street. The point is, God will use things that other people say to prompt you to go his way. And I found this a great surprise when it first happened to me. He will also speak to you through something that you're reading that isn't even a Christian book. You will hardly believe this, but he spoke to me once when I was reading a book about James Bond. Now, if that isn't impossible, well, it really is true. So I'm just telling you, do not read bad books for the sake of finding what God has to say. But if you're reading something reasonably innocent, God can still speak to you through it. That's an important point to listen. So all of that will gradually come together. And then God will provide you, as all this is going on, he provides the resources. There's a lovely story about Gideon and that. Gideon thought he could help God by bringing in the whole of the nearby tribes and getting a big army together. And God said, no, don't want all that. And he whittled it down to the final 300. And that was going to defeat an army of about 10 times its size. There is no doubt that if God provides for you, he provides what you need and not what you don't need. And it's quite important, therefore, that we should remember that God provides the resources to do it. But he also gives us encouragement. There was an occasion with the young people in our Bible class group where we were setting up a weekend mission. And one day when Sylvia and I were praying about it, one morning, God said, everyone who comes will be blessed. And we heard that as from God, and we thought, thank you, Lord, that's what we want. Mm-hmm. So I don't know whether this was a good idea or not, but I told the children that, the youngsters. And one or two of them didn't come because of it. However, the point is that they had been warned. And I say this with respect to the speaker. He was useless. He was a great friend of ours and remained a great friend of ours afterwards. But Sylvia and I were looking at each other and thinking, oh, no. However, he got to the point where he was going to invite the children to give their hearts to the Lord, which was what the whole thing was all about. And he said, shut your eyes. So I obediently shut my eyes and I didn't look round. And he said, bless you, 4 times. And I said to him afterwards, I said, the Lord promised everybody would be blessed. And you only prayed for 4. I said, what's gone wrong? I knew what I thought it was that had gone wrong, but I didn't tell him. And he said, oh, no, he said, you got it wrong, he said. He said, they all put their hands up, so I just blessed the 4 corners of the room. And everybody had been blessed. And we did not have enough adult Christians to minister to the groups of children who needed prayer. We ran out of people. Now, that is an amazing occurrence, but it's absolutely true. And all I'm saying is that when God says that it's going to work, it will work. If God says you're going to defeat the Midianites, don't worry. You will defeat the Midianites, and don't worry. So here's my summary. Your calling is more important than any of your skills or abilities. When God says something, it needs to change your perspective. Your calling trumps all your good points as well as your bad ones. We're God's masterpiece, Ephesians 2:10. And when faith, full of faith, we find we're enabled by God's Spirit to claim the victory. So, like Gideon, we may not be perfect. We may be absolutely sure we're not perfect. We may not think we're an obvious choice for any task that God may give us. But if we listen, step by step, our obedience will bring us through, because we are who he says we are, and he always keeps his promises. Amen.